Mitya, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Pleasure to be here. I hope you can all hear us. If you can't, just signal us in the back. Congratulations, first and foremost, to the German students of the Kennedy School for once again organizing a spectacular conference. We're very, very proud of them, and they deserve all the credit for this. It's important to focus on this particular country, so important to the future of the transatlantic relationship, the keystone country in Europe, and one of the great global powers. There's no question. And there's so many people here who deserve thanks. I want to thank Ambassador Ammann for being here, who is such a great friend of the United States and representing Germany so capably, so well in our country. And we want to thank all of you who are supporting our McCloy Scholars Program. You know, we have this big program that for many years have brought so many German students, and one of the sponsors has been the American Council on Germany, led by my very good friend, Bill Drozdiak, among others. So thank you, all of you, for that. And I have to thank Professor Kaiser, Karl Kaiser, because he's our living Atlanta Brooker here at the Kennedy School as a citizen of both of our great countries. What we thought we would do today is not just speak to you, but I thought I'd interview both Charlie and Dick over the course of the next 20 minutes or so. And then we're going to stop talking, and we're going to call on you to give us your thoughts on the future of the West and to entertain this very interesting question: are we witnessing a global turn or the resurgence of the West? And as Mitya said, we couldn't have two better people than Charlie and Dick, who've both written on this, to speak about that. We are three of us acutely aware that we're three Americans. Not quite sure why we don't have a couple of Germans up here with us, but because we don't, we certainly will want to hear German voices on this issue as soon as we end our short interview. I thought I'd ask them three questions, and just to get you focused. Here's the first question. Isn't the decline of the West overstated, despite the many economic and political problems facing Germany, the EU, and the United States? So think about that for a moment. The second question is, well, surely one of the great stories of our time is the rise of China, the rise of India, the rise of Brazil, among others, to global leadership. How should we Europeans, we North Americans, respond to that politically, economically, in terms of global governance? And third question, doesn't the future of the West depend in the main, to a very great extent, on whether or not we're going to see strong German leadership and strong American leadership together in NATO, in the European Union, and in global council? So those are the three questions I'd like to pose to my colleagues. And let me start, Charlie, perhaps with you. You're the visitor from Georgetown. One could make a case that Europe and North America together, the NATO alliance, geographically, is still the wealthiest part of the world, the most stable, and the most influential collection of countries of the 195 members of the United Nations. We have the two largest economies. The European Union is the international leader on human rights, on rule of law, and on climate negotiations. The United States is, I think, without any question and without a degree of arrogance, but objectively the strongest military power, the strongest political power, and the strongest economic power in the world. So why is there this perception that somehow we are sinking while others are rising?
To respond directly to the question, is the concern about the decline of the West overstated, I would say yes, if you ask the question that way.
Which I did.
Which you did. If you were to rephrase the question, which I will do for you, because I'm your good friend, just for you.
Thank you.
And it were, is global, the prospect of global change overstated? I would say no.
Good.
And so let me unpack that a little bit. I don't think the West is in decline, because that suggests that our best days are behind us. And I think that what we will see in the United States and in Europe over the next 3 to 5 years is a renewal in which we get our mojo back, in which our economies start to grow, in which our democratic institutions, which have not been particularly responsive of late, start to come back to life. But while all of that happens, the world around us is changing. China, India, Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, they are moving up the pecking order. And that is a function of their own development. It has nothing to do with us. So when we get our mojo back, when we snap out of the melancholy in which we now find ourselves, we will snap out into a very different world. And I think it's a world we haven't lived in for a couple hundred years. And by that I mean that I think the era that defines today started in 1815 with the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And that's when Europe sprinted ahead of the rest of the world. And either Europe or North America has been at the leading edge of history ever since. I think that era is starting to come to an end. And that's because our global GDP used to be 75% collectively. We're now down to 50%. We'll probably somewhere soon be 45 and then 40%. And that just means that our ability to call the shots is diminished. So that's why I think the West is not in decline, but the world is changing in a profound and historic way.
So a quick follow-up. So we're in relative decline.
I don't like to use the word decline because it carries a lot of negative baggage.
We're in a relative period of adjustment.
We are in a very significant period of global strategic adjustment. Okay. We got to figure out how to manage it.
Thank you. And Dick, as I ask you the same question I asked Charlie, could I add to that this very significant announcement by President Obama in his State of the Union address on Tuesday evening, that the United States will now proceed to negotiate with the European Union a free trade agreement. Will this not strengthen further, perhaps, for a half century to come, the fortunes of the West?
Yes, it will. Can everyone hear? If not, please let me know. Yes, it definitely will. And the answer for the West to the East is not economic growth vertically, but rather lateral association. As the West gets larger as a unit embracing more and more states, as states in Eastern Europe begin to join the West more and more. Even Japan is now talking about joining NATO, for example. Surprising stuff. So as that happens, you find a longitudinal response to the vertical growth of China and other countries. Also, just one little thing to pique your interest. In one sense, we could talk about the end of the East as we know it, not about the end of the West, because the real problem with the East is it's totally divided. It's like 19th century Europe, and everyone in the East hates everybody else. The Chinese hate the Indians. The Chinese hate the Japanese. The Vietnamese can't stand China. You have country after country where there are major issues that prevent any collective coming together in any kind of political way. Whereas in the West, I think we see, partly as a result of the initiatives taken by President Obama, but of course this was in response, as you all know, to the initiative of Angela Merkel in 2006, when she came over and told George Bush he ought to do something like that. For a whole variety of reasons, it was put on the back burner then. But I think it can become a reality now.
Thank you, Dick. And Professor Rosecrans and I were together in Beijing just about a month ago.
Right.
At a conference between Harvard and Peking University, Beijing University, and fascinating exchange on how China's looking at its relationship with the United States. And that leads to our second question I wanted to ask both of you. How should the United States and Europe respond to the rise of, say, China, India, and Brazil? Those are the three countries that are going to express global power. There are others that will certainly be regional powers, Turkey, Indonesia, Mexico. And I'm reminded that when the Obama administration put forward its new policy, Dick, and I'll go to you first on this, the pivot to Asia, our good friend David Miliband, the former Foreign Secretary of the UK, said, you know, this pivot should be a transatlantic pivot to Asia. NATO together, the US, Canada, and the EU together ought to be refocusing its strategic attention on Asia, not just the United States. The term was harmful because if you're pivoting to someplace, you're pivoting away from someplace else. And this is still the strongest relationship that we have, the NATO-US-EU relationship. So if China is reemerging after 2 centuries of weakness, if India is reemerging, How do we respond to that in terms of how leadership councils, global governance, what's the right answer for us?
Well, I would say confronting what could be described as relative decline, at least in quantitative terms, we respond by making our qualitative precedents even stronger than it has been in the past. If one looks at the US and the Europe together, this is where the center is of all of those industries that have economies of scale. This is where you have the huge proportion of the Fortune 500 companies that sort of are the industrial heartland of the world. In terms of technology, I think this is, again, the center of global economic growth over the next 10, 20 years. It's going to be a very, very long time before China, or indeed even India, begins to get the kind of corporate technological independence that already exists in the United States and Europe, and of course in some degree in Japan. So that I do think the way to respond is to make an even bigger, more powerful economic bloc that has, of course, qualitative implications that once it gets big enough can actually draw the Chinese in, because the Chinese can't afford to be isolated from the power of this economic bloc, which is, as you say, a half or a little bit more of world GDP. There's just absolutely no way that China can expect to sell its goods around the world without an association with Europe and the United States.
Charlie, I'm going to ask you the same question that Dick has just answered, but with a different spin perhaps, because you served in the Clinton administration at the NSC. You've thought a lot about how Europe and America have had responsibility for the world. Professor John Eikenberry of Princeton wrote a book in 2011, Liberal Leviathan, in which he essentially said there is an international system. It's been run by Europeans and Americans for a couple of hundred years. Don't we now need to make room at that leadership table in a much more appreciable way for China, for India, for Brazil, for Turkey, Indonesia? Is that part of what we should do?
I think it's what we have to do to start, and we've already begun, by going from G8 to G20, by changing voting weights within international financial institutions. I don't think it's enough, and here I think I probably differ with Dick and John Eikenberry and Anne-Marie and others, because I think their view of the challenge before us, to paraphrase, is that this order that we collectively, we Americans and Germans and French and Brits and now Poles, this order that we've built is durable despite the shift in power from the West to the rest. That is to say, our rules are universal rules. And Dick just put it, well, China has no choice but to play by our game, right? Because we're going to be 50% of GDP. All the companies are here. I don't think it's going to work that way. I don't think the Chinese want to play our game. I think when we look at a China that will have the largest aggregate GDP in the world within 10 years, when we look at an East Asia that by the next decade will have the largest trade flow, that is to say, the biggest trade flow in the world will be intra-Asia. It won't be across the Pacific, it won't be across the Atlantic, that we're looking at a historic shift. And when I look at China, at state capitalism, at one-party rule, when I look at the Middle East and political Islam, I don't see political developments and developmental paths that are tracking ours. And that's why I think, as I used the phrase in my book, it's going to be no one's world. We're not going to run the show. The Chinese aren't going to run the show. The Indians aren't going to run it. It will be the first time in history that the world is globalized, interdependent, and smushed together, to put it technically, but without the Western anchor. And that scares me. I think it's an uphill battle, but I think that leads me to the following conclusion. We don't just have to open the doors to the chamber and give seats to them. We have to sit down with them and talk about a new set of rules of the road. And those rules of the road will not necessarily be ones that we like.
Okay. then that gets us to the third question, and it's really too bad we have to race through these questions because both of you have said so many interesting things. We could pursue them for a long time. But let's try to link up Charlie's last thought with this question. In part, I think, Charlie, you're exactly right, that we not only need to make room at the leadership table, we need to redefine the international order and the rules by which it is governed. But certainly from a Western perspective, a transatlantic perspective, there are two key countries, Germany and the United States, given our economic power that both of us have, and given the resultant political influence that flows from that, and in the case of the United States, our tremendous military power. We are the leaders of the West. I would submit that the future of the West and our role in the international system will depend in large part on our two countries. And as an American, here's the question, what can we do to straighten out our dysfunctional political system? You know, we have now Senator Hagel, victim of a filibuster. We can't even appoint a CIA director and a Secretary of Defense. We have no hope right now, as far as I can see, to straighten out our economic mess, the structural problems. That's our weakness. On the other hand, I'd ask both of you to comment on that, but on Germany, I was part of an Atlantic Council report last spring that essentially put forward that Germany is a great economic leader, but in terms of its military and political power, it is not leading in the way that we should want Germany to lead. That in essence, at least this American wants a stronger Germany and a more self-confident Germany leading us, helping to lead the West, helping to lead the world. Is it possible for the Americans and Germans to get beyond their problems and be strong members of this new order? Dick?
Yeah, I'd like to just respond to one thing that Charlie said before addressing Germany and the U.S. I think when China joins the New World and tries to reshape its rules or its values, it will have to recognize that it has prospered under Western economic rules. That is how it rose. It rose through export-led development, and it rose through access to Western technology and Western markets. Without that, it would not have risen. So its interest in maintaining its position as part of that Western economic world is overwhelming. If you were just to look at Chinese value added industrially, you know, the Chinese, even though they sell the final stage of their products in the West, in Germany and Japan and the United States, their contribution to the final value is much less than 50%. So this means that Western technology is still very important, and their need is to have access to that, which they cannot do if they change the economic rules. So the economic rules, I think, are set in stone and will not be changed. In terms of political rules, yes, of course, there's got to be a change in those rules. Things can't be exclusively decided by the G7 or G8 or even by the G20 as far as that's concerned. We have to have a broader group of countries to do this. But I think if one looks ahead, there's no reason why China or India has to change the fundamental territorial rules that exist now. Those rules preventing additional expansion and military takeovers have benefited those countries to a very high degree. It's permitted their economic development without having to focus overmuch on the military side. So that I think even when they begin to change the political rules, they're still going to be concerned to maintain the territorial relationships that more or less exist right now.
And to China's credit,
yes,
China is rising within the U.S.-European system and,
that's right,
and not struggling against the system. But Charlie believes that that might not always be the case. That's how I see this disagreement between you.
Well, you know, I think that history suggests that as emerging powers emerge, they tuck in under the existing order and piggyback on it, and they do very well.
Yeah.
And then they hit that inflection point where they're at the top and they say, maybe we might want to just tweak these rules and push here and push there. And so I just, you know, we don't know where China will end up, but have they sort of played by our rules, sort of? But when I look at China and I see 45% of its GDP still produced by state-owned companies, when I see a country that basically jerry-rigs its currency,
And cybercrime.
and cybercrime,
And IPR violations.
and human rights violations, I just don't see a country that has said, where's the West, let us in.
Right.
I just don't see that happening.
Fascinating, this discussion. Can we quickly just address this third question, and then we'll go to the audience and to German voices. Don't we need a stronger Germany and a stronger America?
Yeah, I mean, I'm bullish on the West. I'm an Atlanticist. I think most of the people in this room are, and I'm also someone who takes comfort in the fact that 20 plus years after the end of the Cold War, the West is very much a going concern. It says to me that this is a political community that has a natural resilience and durability. We keep coming back to each other, right? Bush comes into office, says, Europe, get out of the way. In the second term, what does he do? He gets on an airplane, he flies to Brussels, and he says, I'm sorry, I still love you.
That was his first act. We called it the Olive Branch Tour when we went to meet Chancellor Schroeder.
Right. And Obama comes into office, he's impatient with Europe. Oh, don't tell me I have to have another summit with those guys. And then mid-first term, what does he do? He flies to Lisbon for a NATO summit, says this is the most important relationship in the world. Right. So something's going on there. That having been said, this side of the Atlantic, as you put it, is politically dysfunctional in a way that none of us could have ever imagined.
Right.
I live in Washington. It's appalling what goes on in that city. And I wish I could give you, a three-step plan to get us back on our horse, and I can't. What I can say is I think the foundational problem is the economy.
Yes.
Because I think what's happened in the United States is the fact that our middle class has seen its real wages steadily decline since the end of the 1980s, has brought back to American political life ideological polarization of the sort that we haven't seen since the New Deal and arguably since the 19th century. And so I think we need to fix the economy to fix the politics, but fixing the economy in part requires good decisions. So there's a chicken and egg problem. On the other side of the Atlantic, I would put it slightly differently than you did, and that is that, yes, you need German leadership. We saw that in the Eurozone crisis. Chancellor Merkel, excuse me for being somewhat critical, was asleep for several years. All of a sudden, she wakes up. She says, oh my God, the wheels are coming off. And ever since that happened at the end of 2011, the Euro crisis has gotten better and better and better. And in my mind, the necessary condition was that Berlin said it's time to lead. It is time to get
economically.
Economically.
Right.
It's time to get ahead of public opinion rather than follow public opinion. But it's not enough for Germany to be strong. Germany has to be strong within the context of a strong Europe. Because Germany alone, France alone, UK alone, they're too small to matter in a world with these economies of scale. The United States needs, on the other side of the Atlantic, a strong Europe, and a strong Germany is a necessary condition for getting there.
And the United States
Could I
needs...
respond to this at some point?
Yes.
It doesn't have to be now. You go right ahead and talk.
Oh, yes. No, we weren't ignoring you. In fact, I was just about to turn to you.
Oh, good.
Yes. And say, based on what Charlie just said, I'm a former ambassador to NATO, and I would just say that we do need a much stronger Germany in NATO. We need stronger German defense spending. We need a Germany that's willing to deploy to places like Libya and Mali, along with the French and British, which Germany has not done. That's what I think we need. Do you agree with that as part of the solution?
Partly. I agree with it in the sense that the German military presence around the world has got to be slightly greater than it's been now, rather than simply in northern Afghanistan where no one's going to get hurt. Obviously, you've got to take more responsibilities of some kind or another. But I think on economics and in political areas, you have to look at de facto, not just at de jure. What is happening behind the scenes? What are the relationships that Angela Merkel has forged with France, even with England? that actually make Europe a much more effective actor than if she got out and broadcast, German imperialism for Europe, we're going to take over Europe and you all have to get in line. That would be the absolute worst course of action. The key thing is to do it de facto. Get others to come to you and actually build cohesion that would not be built by any assertion of an extremely strong German political line. I think what Germany has done up to now, with some exceptions, going back to your point, has been brilliant. And it's been brilliant in part because it hasn't been fully noticed. I think we're going to look back at Angela Merkel and see a figure in Western history not unlike that in terms of influence of that of Bismarck in years past.
That's quite the statement to end on. Thank you to, there's so much more we could say.
Yes.
To Dick and Charlie, thank you very much. We want to hear from German voices. And Ambassador, we must give you pride of place if you'd like to. We have 2 microphones for Ambassador Ammann. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
It's not turned on.
Working?
No.
No.
Here's another one.
No. They need to be turned on.
They have to be turned on. Is it turned on?
It's turned on? Okay. I can shout if you like.
Yeah.
Of course, it's hard to say anything after your statement. But before I try to make a remark on that, let me say that the transatlantic trade and investment initiative, which is now, I think, the huge project we have ahead of us, has much more meaning than just economic.
Right.
It is a huge economic chance for all of us, but much more strategic. And so we really must work hard and do what we can to make this real, and not leave it to the, let's say, bureaucrats who have been fighting in trenches in Brussels for so long over chloride chicken and
Right.
strange things.
Right.
That's my first remark. My second remark is, this is very close to what you say, form follows function. Spend the money we have on tanks, for example, would be a bad investment these days.
Right.
What we found in the last years in the context of a debt crisis in Europe was that we really had to invest big. We had invested, and we did this with a two-thirds majority in the Deutsche Bundestag. We set aside $250 billion. That's much more than any defense budget ever would look like. $250 billion to rescue the other European, or to say to rescue the European idea. And so we will invest the money where the need is. So this is the second statement. My third remark goes to the political system, and there was reference to the workings in Washington, and your remarks on German leadership. We cannot put our foot down in Europe and say, look, everybody shall follow us, and we will show you a way.
Right.
The political process in Europe, and I think also here, is about consensus building. Convince people that we should take that direction. And that's what we have seen in Europe, I would say, is quite remarkable. In difficult times, when lots of money was at stake, when people were rebellious, look what happened in Greece. You had demonstrations, you had a leftist parties springing up. And in the end, governments fell, but we saw governments coming in, like Monti, like Rajoy, like the Greek government, that in the end was on the path of reform. So it was not the populist movements that carried the day. So we do this with convincing and setting example, but not by putting our foot down, as I said.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I think that what we'll do is take a couple of questions and observations and then ask Charlie and Dick to comment on them, if you would be glad to do that. Other questions?
Right there.
Yes, sir. And we have a microphone for you. And then we're going to look for students to ask questions.
There's one in the middle
Good.
back.
My name is Fred Hansen. I'm from Beverly, Massachusetts, Beverly Farms. My feeling on the subject of this discussion is that we overestimate our relation to Europe, and we don't see what's growing up in our Asian backyard. China has 1.5 trillion people. You can't beat the numbers, okay? And a recent economic study of the London Economist has pointed out that China and India controlled about 70% of the total world's GDP between 400 AD and the early 17th century, when Europe, with the superior weaponry, conquered these countries and put them down. We have experienced miracles in China and India, kind of. We have been very surprised. We have to think that more surprises are in good order, okay? We have to brace ourselves for more surprises.
And do you have a question
One
for the
other
do you have
point,
a question
that's
for
my
the
final
panelists
point,
here?
is
Sir, do you have a
that the
question?
United States, the export markets are drying out because we have competition from Brazil, Germany, Italy, etc., not to speak of China and India. Okay, that's just one point. It doesn't comprehensively address the issue, but it is some points that we have to think of.
Thank you. Thank you. Student question. Yes, all the way in the back center, right here. This gentleman, yes. And then we'll go up here to the, yes, right there. Thank you.
Thank you. Noah Freilich, actually just up from Portland, Maine. And I was wondering if you guys could speak to my first thought when you gave the first question was, how do American leaders need to reflect on certain sections of this population that immediately respond with, well, yes, we are falling rapidly, the sky is falling, and that want to grasp to that primacy that they feel we're losing. And so how can American leaders address sort of insular issues like that in a global relationship construct?
Okay, can we add to your question, just for Charlie and Dick, what will be the impact of the Tea Party and of neo-isolationist movements in the United States on our ability to lead, which is an important question for Americans? There's a student right here. Yeah. Sir, yes, please.
Yeah, I would like to side with Ambassador Aman, not only because it's a safe thing to do on foreign policy issues, but also because I think when it comes to German leadership in Europe, I feel like maybe we've moved past an era where military power is everything, and rather Europe should be focusing on what it's good at, and that is setting a moral standard for Asia maybe, and maybe in that way creating this drawing in effect towards China and just offering opportunities when it comes to human rights and as he said, spending money where the need is rather than spending too much on military.
Well, thank you for the question, and let me just ask both of you to address that when the time comes. But I would say to you, just prerogative of the chair, Germany has responsibilities in NATO, which is an all-for-one, one-for-all organization. And so if Germany's not willing, if it's spending 1.3% of its GDP on defense, and we're spending 4.5%, you're asking the American taxpayers and American soldiers to do the work that Germans should be doing with us. So this is an emotional issue, as well as a political issue on this side of the Atlantic, that I hope our panelists will address. Other questions? Yes, right up in the back.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question relating to the NATO question. If the powers are changing in this world and we're moving towards a more multipolar system, or maybe a system where we just don't know who's leading anymore, or if anyone is leading, do you think a more offensive security policy would be advisable, or rather a more kind of defensive, not threatening potential rising powers. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. We have another question here, and then we'll go here. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Christian Thies, and I'm an engineering student from Georgia Tech. And I was wondering, when following your discussion in the context of a globalizing world, is a set of Western rules, as you mentioned them, is this still the right approach to face the global economic and social challenges? Or do we need to maybe talk about a new set of rules, maybe together with those emerging countries? And if yes, in which direction should that go? Thank you.
Thank you. That was one of the points that Professor Kupchan made. That's a good question. Thank you. Yes, please, right here. Right here in front. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Selma Stern. I'm an MPA student at SIPA at Columbia. And my question pertains to this debate about German responsibilities within NATO. So the title of this conference last year, I believe, was The German Angst of Leadership. And this German angst was not really fear of spending too much on the military, but it went much deeper than that. It's this fear of basically doing what Margaret Thatcher was so afraid of, resurging on the world scene as a kind of belligerent power. So I'm always really surprised to find this disconnect between German thinking, this kind of doubtful thinking about our own country, and then American expectations. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Thank you. Thank you. And maybe a final question here, and then we're going to ask you to, Dick and Charlie, you can speak to any of these, not all of them if you don't wish, that you'd like to in your remarks. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Jakob Schroth. I'm a U.S. foreign policy student at American University in D.C. One remark, one question. I totally agree that we completely overestimate the pivot to Asia. If you really consider the investments of the United States are investing more in Ireland, companies and the government in Ireland, than in Brazil, Russia, India, and China together. The United States is more investing in Belgium than in India. And so my question is, sometimes I feel that we are very strong in the transatlantic narrative about common values, common goals, and these days everyone, and that's great, is talking about a possible transatlantic free trade agreement. But if you talk about German leadership, especially as we face an election year, if we come to the details, will Germany allow American genetic modified food in our stores? What kind of labor laws will we find common ground there? So do you think that beside this common narrative, Germany will take the leadership to really get to the point and clarify these details?
Thank you very much. These are wonderful questions. Thank you to all of you who've asked them. We don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to ask Dick and Charlie if you wanted to take on some of these questions and speak.
Yep, I'd be happy to.
Please.
Of course, I can't address every question, but I think it's important to look at the shape of the world in the future. The shape of the world in the future is not going to depend upon high levels of military spending, because people can't afford to continue to spend the amounts that they have spent in the past, and the sequester in the United States makes that abundantly clear. Even the Chinese will get to the point where further military spending will turn out to be a mistake. There seem to be very interesting new things happening in the Pentagon that will, I think, underpin that, with much less of an emphasis upon platforms, that is, tanks, carriers, new fighters and bombers, et cetera, and more on communications and the ability to interrupt the communications of other states, so that you don't need to have huge numbers of tanks or other kind of forces in place. As a result of this, I think the basic focus for the West in the future will be to emphasize the qualitative aspects, not the quantitative ones. In quantitative terms, of course, the Chinese will have a bigger formal GDP than we do. But in qualitative terms, where it really counts, what are the things you're making? Who designs the things you're making? Who actually carries out those designs? I think at that level, we're going to find the West is still very strong. And in terms of rules, You've got to remember, rules are not simply a matter of volition, sitting down and saying, let's change our standards or let's change our rules. They're also a matter of economic fact. You can't alter very much the economic rules that govern the world. You have to abide by those rules or you don't succeed. The Chinese have recognized this and the Indians have done so, and there's no evidence they're going to try to change that. So they're in perforce to a world that does have certain Western orientations economically, and I believe is going to continue to do so as well.
Dick, thank you. Charlie?
I'll just try to skip through a bunch of these issues. On the your question, sir, about globalization in Asia, I think that, and this comes back to exchange we had about how to fix the U.S. As I said, I'm most worried about the economic issue, and in particular, what average Americans who live in Ohio are going to do in year 2025. I think Germany is in much better shape in the sense that they have a system of high-quality manufacturing, vocational training, apprenticeship, which is one of the reasons that the German economy has generally fared well during globalization. I think globalization has been harder on the United States, and that's why I don't think we are just going through a dip in the business cycle. I think what the U.S. is going through now has deeper roots, and we need a national conversation about how to educate American workers so that they will have reasonably well-paying jobs. And we're not there yet.
Right.
And I think that would be the top priority from my perspective of what we should be talking about as Americans.
So the most important foreign policy issue for you is economics at home.
Is home.
Yeah.
Is getting our act together here.
Right.
And that relates to the second point is, I think that our leaders are misreading our public, our electorate, in the sense that Romney and Obama were both going around and thumping their chests that this is a new American century and America's an exceptional nation and blah, 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 blah. But in the end of the day, I think Americans have had enough of going off and trying to turn Iraq into Ohio, right? They've had enough. Yeah. And as a consequence, there is a rethinking of the nature of American internationalism in the way that I don't think we've seen as adults. Maybe it happened in the Vietnam era. I wasn't old enough to know because I was born around then, but I think that there, I wouldn't call it neo-isolationism, although there are aspects of that in the Tea Party, but I think we're heading into an era of strategic retrenchment in which we will be doing less, not more, in which our footprint, particularly in the Middle East, is going to lighten, in which our president is going to look at a place like Syria and say, I don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And that's going to change the world. And I think we as Americans and Europeans need to kind of figure out what that means. And I think the Europeans are also going to be in a somewhat similar inward mode. Nobody is going to be looking for fights. The one caveat is Iran, and we don't have time to get into that right now. Should NATO be more offensive? No. I think after Afghanistan, Libya, staying cautiously out of Mali and Syria, I'm not sure that NATO is going to be fighting a lot of wars.
Outside of the territory of the NATO.
Or period, because I don't think we're going to see a lot of wars. Yeah. And that's why I would associate myself with the ambassador and say, well, you know, we need new transatlantic projects. And the best one that I see coming around the corner is the free trade area. I think it's extremely important economically, but even more so politically and symbolically. And I'm cautiously optimistic that it will work, coming to the final question, because, you know, most of the heavy lifting has already been done. The average tariff on transatlantic goods is 3% or lower. And so I think we can get the rest of the way. It won't be easy, but I think it can be done. Finally, question about new sets of rules. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to. I think if we pretend that the rest of the world is simply going to dock in our harbor, year by year, the international order we live in is going to deteriorate. If we sit down with emerging powers and discuss sovereignty, legitimacy, responsibility to protect, what constitutes social justice, and take them seriously and have a conversation about those issues, then I think we will get it right. And by getting it right, I mean end up in a rules-based international system. If we think that that rules-based system is going to be our rules, we're living in la-la land.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Dick. On that note, let me thank both Charlie Kupchan of Georgetown and Professor Dick Rosecrans of Harvard University. It's been a great discussion. We've just touched the surface of these issues, but I want to thank you. Thanks to the questioners. And again, thank you, Mitya, to you and the McCoy Scholars for this great conference.
First of all, let me apologize for the slight glitch with the microphones. We're going to work on that, and we'll get it right for the next discussion. Thank you, Professor Burns, Professor Rosecrans, and Professor Kupchan for a very spirited discussion that did touch on a lot of topics. Some of those we will explore in more detail this afternoon and also tomorrow. There was a lot of talk, or some talk at least, of German leadership. As a small token of our appreciation, we have something from an area where Germany certainly is leading, and that is Riesling wine for Professor Rosecrans and Professor Kupchan.
I would like a BMW.
Well, you can talk to our friends from Lufthansa if they can provide more flights, but I'm afraid we don't have BMW up there yet. We'll work on that for next year. One area where Germany is certainly not leading is the production of rum, and so Professor Burns, we got you some Brazilian rum. Thank you so much, and please join me again in thanking our three panelists.